Thank you for inviting me to give this talk to this online conference. I prepared it with Quentin Toffolini, and we understood that you invited us to discuss on-farm experimentation challenges from the point of view of our own work on Living Labs and on knowledge production and sharing to support farmers' transition processes. OFE and Living Labs both advocate for multi-stakeholder participation and for working in real-life context, which are, to a certain extent, fostering changes in experimentation habits in knowledge and innovation production. The red thread for this presentation will be to propose a framework which enables us to be reflexive on our experimentation practices, and then to discuss how new challenges might appear if on-farm experimentation is to support farmers' transition towards agroecology. My plan will be as follows. First, I will discuss Living Labs and OFE principles and then see if they are similar or not. But then step 2, analyzing the experimentation practices and therefore try to propose a framework to do that and try to analyze the diversity of them, and then go a step further by asking which kind of new activities and new roles are necessary for OFE if OFE is meant to support farmers' transition processes, and then I will go to concluding remarks. So here on this slide, which I will not detail, I just recall the main feature, aims and principle as identified in the Lacoste and Hall paper in 2021. Actually, OFE is seen as challenging researchers in their way to collaborate around data collection and processing. And as you certainly all know, OFE is described as an innovation process involving different agricultural stakeholders around an experimentation. And it's taking place in field, or at least at a relevant scale for farmers. A farm experimentation is meant to support farmers' management decision rather than farmers' transition towards agroecology. So keep in mind that in this presentation, we will look at the outcome of OFE from a staggered point of view, but it is purposely to discuss how this might challenge OFE practices. So here are just briefly recalled the aims and principle of OFE. Let me now step to the Living Lab principle, and they are defined by the European Network of Living Labs. Notice first that experimentation as a test of new technologies is always at the heart of this model. Such tests are designed in real-life context with users and imply co-creation process. Second, Living Labs is often associated with public, private, academic, citizen partnership, particularly the implementation of participatory processes that therefore are needed. So Living Labs are user-centered, open innovation ecosystem based on systematic user co-creation approach, and it is meant to integrate research and innovation processes in real-life community and settings. Living Labs are thus often described as new forms of real-world experimentation, which share the objective to accelerate transformations towards more sustainable society and to transfer existing knowledge into action. They intend to blur the boundary between laboratory and society and between the production of a technology and its use. Let's move now to the characteristic of agroecosystem Living Labs as McPhee and Hall wrote them in their paper in 2021. They analyzed various agroecosystem Living Labs in order to identify some specificities. They characterize them through aims, activities, participants, and context. Here in light blue, I have pointed or underlined the characteristics which refer to possible various implementation within different Living Labs, while in dark blue are more stable and an ambiguous characteristic of this agroecosystem living labs. In italics, I underline the characteristics which I found shared between agroecosystem living labs and on-farm experimentation. But maybe instead of going further on this discussion with the colors of this slide, let me even discuss some of the questions which might arise when you try to compare agroecosystem living labs and on-farm experimentation. Some of the questions are there research-driven processes or community-driven ones? Are the stakeholders taking into account mainly agricultural one, or is it larger, like citizens, local communities, local authorities? Which challenge are taking into account, those of the farmers or those of the innovation ecosystem at large? What is managed? Data processing, the collection, or the innovation process, or the innovation transition process? If you all say that on-farm experimentation and agroecosystem living labs need iterative processes, is it done for creating database or for supporting learning challenges in transition processes? And if experimenting in real-life context is claimed, is it as farmer level or at agroecosystem scale? Finally, do we mean to do interdisciplinary work, or do we wish to develop transdisciplinary work into real-life settings? Those questions which we can address when we compare the on-farm experimentation and agro-living labs principle. Maybe we can move a step forward now and look, rather than at the principle, look at their practices. So if we want to look at OFE or agroecosystem living labs practices, we think it useful to discuss OFE and agro living labs as boundary object. The notion of boundary object has been introduced by Starr and Grismer in 1989, and it's an arrangement connecting various social words or community of practice without initial consensus on the way to characterize or handle such object. So an object, in this case, can be either a theory or an equipment or a space. Therefore, it can be either material or unmaterial. So why do we think that OFE or agroeco-living labs are boundary objects? It's because they can be interpreted differently across communities, showing plasticity, but stick to a common identity as defined by some principles to maintain integrity across social worlds and contexts, which means that they are robust. OFE and agroecosystem living labs interact with members of various social groups, farmers, citizens, researchers, data managers, but can be used to very different ends by each group or individuals, leading to different interpretation, which means that they are flexible and there is an interpretative flexibility which boundary objects have. And finally, OFE and agroecosystem living lab rely on various infrastructure and practice to build a common, which doesn't mean consensual, understanding of agricultural or agroecosystem realities within multi-stakeholder settings. So anyway, to capture OFE and agro-living labs as boundary objects, we think that we need to analyze the experimentation practices which construct them. We refer to Shaping, Laura, and others' work quoted here at the bottom of this slide to consider experimentation as activities required to intervene on a given reality and to interpret what is observed in order to demonstrate a hypothesis, which was at the beginning of the intervention, and to generate new knowledge. Experimentation requires instrument and is also subject to uncertainty. We propose in particular to look at OFE and agroecosystem living labs as a loci to implement multi-stakeholder experimentation processes sensitive to emergent properties within real-life settings based on end-user involvement and supporting learning processes at experimentation, but also at a larger scale. So more precisely, to capture and analyze the diversity of experimentation practices, we propose to look at 4 dimensions related to intervention and to demonstration and knowledge generation. Methods and means for controlling the intervention and integrating emergence, perimeter construction in a real-life context, integration of a wide range of knowledge into problematization, and integration of a wide range of experience into the assessment process. In fact, to be more specific, the 4 dimensions are then developed into key variables, which we looked at in each case study that we observed in agroecosystem living labs or in OFE. Some clusters of features then can be found at this variable level and be used to define some types which reveals common ways of implementing OFE and living labs principle. By doing so, we can investigate the infra-variability of the OFE on the one hand and of agro-living labs on the other hand. And we also can compare their respective inter-variability. So this is something I can just illustrate on the following slide. For example, I take here 2 variables like purpose and forms of diagnosis or main objective and purpose of the evaluation. And if I just detail the first one, you can see that you have intra-variability both in OFE and in agroecosystem living labs. For example, diagnosis can be done on field states, on farmers' practices, on farm economics, or in the agro-living labs, diagnosis can be done at local innovation initiative, on innovation systems, or on agroecosystem states. And you can see that there is no clear overlap between the objects on which the diagnoses are done in OFE on the one side and in agro-living labs on the other side. So we believe that with such a framework, we can support a discussion among practitioners in order to see the diversity of the way to implement OFE and living lab principle and discuss how it can be used to improve each way of doing it. Let me now go a step further in my presentation to discuss how experimentation practices might support farmers' transition towards agroecology. OFE principles mainly address data management and analysis processes that are meant to support farmers' decision-making, as schematized in Lacoste and All paper. On the other hand, First and All propose to schematize farmers' transition as a step-by-step design experimentation process, which requires learning and knowing dynamics, as showed on various examples in Menard and All paper. Supporting transition therefore means to support this learning and knowing process, which are considered as key ones also in OFE. First et al. Identified 2 key issues for agronomists, for example: producing relevant knowledge to enhance exploration and definition of desired future, and developing indicators to assess the dynamics of the system and its performance. This means that, as Toffolini showed, it needs to develop indicators which are adjusted to the step-by-step process in order to take on board unforeseen dynamics which nevertheless emerge and have to be taken on board to reach the desirable outcomes. This challenges the data management and processing for the OFE because it needs to be adaptive and flexible and to produce as well, if possible, new knowledge to enhance exploration. So this might result in different questions that we need to address if we want to make OFE practices having an impact on farmers' transition learning processes. For example, it might require to address the question of how to produce relevant knowledge format for enabling farmers' exploration processes. How can we foster experience and knowledge sharing during experimentation, because it is a step-by-step process? How can we take on board a diversity of farmers' experience in designing data collection and management? How to support learning process in a wide community of practice? In order to address this question, I will just show some of the work which has been done by the colleagues and which might help to think about the answer to which can be done to this question. So, for example, in various co-creation projects with advisors, farmers, researchers, and trainers, some new formats have been proposed to support co-design workshops among farmers and exploration of a given farmer. 3 different formats have been proposed and tested: table linking biological cycle, functional role play by species, and potential techniques to apply. Schemes representing the logic of action which enable farmers to tackle some agri-production issues, and what we call exploration trees, linking design targets, functions, and agricultural practices. A method to develop such format has been built with a system experimenter working with different public, farmers, students, advisors. The method is meant to valorize the great amount of data collected on system experimentation taking place in long-term experiments, and to do it by making relevant decisions, to choose the topics which are best addressed by the data, but which are also relevant for the farmers, to choose then the best way to organize the data in order to build the adequate format. And this is done with farmers and other advisor people, as shown on the picture through the arrows. And this means doing this format, doing this method to come from data to knowledge actionable. This means translation work, and this means new activity in order to make this translation work. Also, such translation work already point the need for new roles to support collective knowledge production and management. I would also like to point that there are also other roles which Slimy and all pointed in order to support transition processes towards agroecology. Indeed, Slimy and all say that farmers learn in a way that enables them to elaborate their experience when they faced what Proust and all, in a previous slide I showed the representation Proust and all did. So Proust and all named it an unsatisfactory situation. But here, following Dewey work, Slimy and all call it an experiential environment under indeterminacy. This indeterminacy can result from a perceived change which implies to reassess the situation and to adjust the means and ends of action, but it can also be related to a change of the desirable future that the farmers want to achieve. Based on Dewey's work, Slimy and al. Analyzed how farmers develop inquiries to face indeterminacy in their transaction with their environment. More specifically, they analyzed the way collectives, such as peer groups or wider communities, online communities, can induce or support the reduction of indeterminacy. This point, new ability to endorse the role of managing peer exchanging, which enable farmers to move from an experiential environment under indeterminacy to a well-balanced one, or managing a wide community of inquiry, enabling farmers to create new ways and to value their situation by inducing indeterminacy. To conclude, I would say, gathering all the things I tried to discuss in this presentation, I will say that first, there is a need to discuss the overlap of OFE and agroecosystem living labs at the level of the practices, rather than just comparing their key principles. Second, I would say that it is interesting to look at the variety of the OFE practices using a common framework of analysis in order to be reflexive without being normative about such practices. So the framework we propose is a starting point, but it needs to be further developed. Third point, if OFE practitioners wish to support farmers' transition, then it applies to adapt data collection to the emergent properties of the agroecosystem, meaning to build an adaptive intervention, move from data management to knowledge and experience sharing among stakeholders, mean also to carry on new activities in order to pay attention to translation processes, such as to problematize in a real-life context, to produce scientific knowledge, and to valorize this knowledge beyond the intervention level, and also to endorse new roles, for example, to be part of a community of inquiry, as shown just before. So thank you for your attention, and here are all the references I cited during my presentation.